Hey friends, this is Eric the Mind Control Guy. I really appreciate everybody listening in on Coast to Coast with the delightful Miss Connie Willis and hear me talk. And as I figured, I would probably have to kick a couple trolls to the curb and block them because they come in there to do what trolls always do, just instigate and the usual nonsense. But for everybody else, I really do appreciate you listening in and reaching out and contacting me and all that kind of good stuff. But anyway, in this particular book, Men in Black by Conrad Bauer, I'm going to read you something real briefly, a couple of pages, that really makes me think about a movie that was made in 1988 and now has become a classic comedy sci fi film. And I'm going to go ahead and put the camera up and show the cover of that DVD while I read this book. Okay, on page 53 in Conrad Bauer's book Men in Black: Evidence and True Stories About Earth's Most Mysterious Cover Agents, page 53, chapter is called Silent Witnesses to the MIB. Peter and Sandra Taylor were in the middle of a late-night drive home across the English countryside on August 16, 1972, when the radio began wildly oscillating from station to station. Shortly after the onset of this odd interference, the Taylors looked out the driver's side window to see a brightly lit craft attempting to land behind a group of trees. As they followed the winding road, they were startled to see that the object had landed in a spot that they would pass right by. Peter, more than a bit unnerved, took a car down to cautiously slow speed as they stared out the kaleidoscope of colors that the strange vehicle was emitting. The craft was shaped like a large melon and had flashing lights crisscrossing all around its surface. As they continued to gaze at it, the Taylors noticed that there were other cars on the road witnessing the incredible event. There were two cars up ahead of them, closer to the object, and there was a car trailing some distance behind them. All of these carloads of people must have seen the craft, but none of them were inclined to stop. The other motorists simply passed the UFO by and went on their way. The craft now began to exhibit an even stranger phenomenon. A brightly illuminated door of sorts began to materialize on the side of the craft. The opening began just as one small dot of light, but then expanded to trace out an entire door on the ship's hull. Thoroughly in shock at this point, Peter brought the car to a stop as he continued to stare at the object. His paralysis was broken only when he saw that his wife was actually trying to get out of the car. Sandra later explained that she felt a strange kind of compulsion to walk toward the craft. She opened the car door to go, and only her husband's valiant effort to hold her in place kept her from leaving. The next thing the Taylors recall is taking off at a high rate of speed, barreling down the road and leaving the object behind. With the strange UFO safely in the rearview mirror, they agreed to simply forget about the whole thing. The very next day, however, the couple had their first encounter with the Men in Black. These MIB came out in the guise of police officers whom the Taylors found waiting for them in a squad car in the driveway of their home. There was no reason for them to be there. No one had called the police, yet they were parked on the Taylors' private property. When they made eye contact, one of them immediately shouted at them, "Have you anything to report?" Peter and Sandra supposed that the policemen were referring to the UFO sighting of the day before, but they had already agreed not to talk about the event. So they both responded in the negative. This particular officer just wouldn't take no for an answer. However, he continued questioning them, demanding to know what they were doing, where they had been, and why were they coming home so late. Since they hadn't committed any crime, receiving the third degree from a random police officer was extremely unsettling. but eventually they managed to make their way past the strange figure and on into the safety of their home. The officer's behavior was aggressive and highly unusual, but that doesn't necessarily mean he was an MIB. Bad cops are everywhere. After all, at any rate, the next day Sandra had a drastic change of heart, deciding that she did want to tell her story. She called the police department herself, and it wasn't very long at all before two officers showed up at the Taylors' door. In fact, the speed which they arrived was a bit unusual since the nearest police station was several miles away. Adding to the strangeness was the fact that these officers seemed to know all about the incident before Peter or Sandra even explained it to them. The men even volunteered the one kernel of information that Peter and Sandra figured they wouldn't know. They asked, other cars were there, weren't they? After a few more questions, the men informed them that the local police had already thoroughly investigated the matter and determined that the Taylors had seen was nothing more than a large tent. You can only imagine the couple's reaction as they were told that their life-changing encounter with a UFO was nothing more than a large circus tent pitched on the ground. And then all these years later, we find this goofy movie, Killer Clowns from Outer Space. And they show a kind of image in that movie where this thing was flying and it landed on the ground and it looked to be a big circus tent. And it had a strange door on the side. It makes me wonder, what was the real inspiration for this movie, The Killer Clowns from Outer Space? I just wanted to put that in there, or should I say, I wanted to put this out there and let me know your thoughts. Thank you.